Welcome back once again. Today, we are going to be starting our look at progressivism. And progressivism, the progressive era, if we look at that word progressive or progressivism, we should probably notice, or you probably do notice, that it looks and sounds like progress, which means to make something better and to improve something. And the progressive movement is something that really had been building for quite some time. We've actually been looking here and there over the past several chapters that we have studied at people that were seeking out some kind of reform. And so really it has its roots way back before the progressive movement really took off. And it's kind of, agreed upon that the progressive movement really sort of officially get started around 1900 or so, but that it has its roots in earlier movements. We know that because labor is going to be a part of that. That is a movement that had been going on for quite some time. We had seen that, issue over currency and the greenbacks, the populists that we talked about. They talked about a lot of things that are later going to be taken up here by the progressives, the social gospel. All of that stuff is kind of woven into this progressive movement, this movement by so many different individuals and so many different people to try to overall improve the United States, to improve the lives of average Americans, to improve the economy, to just make America better and to make America's democracy stronger, to better realize what they saw as like the true American vision, what those ultimate goals for America were. How could they improve society to make those things a reality? So we'll start by just talking about what progressivism is. What were the kind of things that progressives were trying to do? When we say they were trying to overall improve society, what exactly did that mean for them? Because this is a wide and very diverse group of people and groups. It is not just one simple idea. There's really not a simple way to describe what progressivism is. But progressivism ultimately, I like to think of progressivism and the progressives, the people that supported these kinds of movements. It's kind of like a big umbrella. This is like a big umbrella labeled progressivism. And there's so many different things that fit under the umbrella of progressivism. So people could have been working in a lot of different areas, seeking out lots of different reforms that may seem like they're not related, but it's all under this umbrella or within this scope of progressivism and the progressive movement. So these are people that ultimately just believed that industrialization and urbanization had just greatly changed the United States. Maybe not all for the bad, but it had changed everything. And these are people that overall, like I said, it's a very wide and a very diverse range of groups and individuals, but their overall goal was to improve life, was to improve America, to improve the life of average Americans and everyday people, and to overall make society better in this more modern industrial age. So it's not about reversing the changes that have been made. It's saying that, the economy has changed, the way people live has changed, the way we produce things, the way that we work, the way that we live our lives has changed. And so other things have got to change too in order to accommodate that and in order to make that livable, in order to make the country, live up to its promises and make sure that those are promises of democracy are things that everybody is going to share in. So they just they feel like we can't live in a world anymore where, the government just doesn't respond to industry and the government doesn't respond to some of these changes, that there has to be action taken, because ultimately what progressives are seeking is more action by the government, more government regulations, more laws, more protections, more different things in place to make the life better. So the progressives truly believed in the power of the government to do that, to be an instrument for social justice, to be an instrument for change. So some of the things that progressives might have been after, just some very general things, if we could break that down a little bit more specifically. Progressives, some of them are seeking out political changes. Remember, they're coming out of the days of a great deal of political corruption, of the big, city bosses and political machines, of this really unhealthy marriage between politics and business. So progressives are going to be overall trying to make the system work better. They're going to be trying to weed out corruption. They are going to be trying to make the government more democratic. They're going to be trying to get power out of the hands of those big party bosses and into the hands of the people. We'll talk about some of the ways that they tried to do that. Some of them are after social change, whether it is helping the plight of the poor, people in the cities. We saw those social reformers, people like Jane Addams, trying to improve the life of immigrants, improve educational opportunities. All those different kind of things will be included under progressives. A big thing is economic change, going after big business, the big trusts, the monopolies, all those sorts of things. So overall, progressives saw, this gap between rich and poor and felt that was something that had to be fixed. Labor disputes, violence over labor disputes, racism, even political machines, political corruption, all of that stuff. And they said government has to be active to fix that. So they're not necessarily backward looking, saying that we need to go back to the way we were. They just recognize the country has changed. So other things have to change too. We can't live in this very Jeffersonian, the government doesn't get involved, totally hands off. We just, the government shouldn't be into those things. That no longer is going to work. The problems that we have now are just too complex for that whole Jeffersonian model. So progressives could have been feminists. They could have been labor union organizers. But a lot of the time, these are, academics. They are white collar professionals. They are, a lot of them, women. They're educated people. This is an upper middle class kind of a movement. Ultimately, people that believe the government should correct these problems. Now, one important aspect of progressivism, of course, is getting people aware of what those problems were. And that is where a group of people called the muckrakers come in. Muckrakers were writers. Specifically, they are progressive, usually journalists, although some of them actually write novels and publish books, but they are journalists who are exposing a lot of these problems. Thus the name muckrakers. They are digging up the dirt and showing all these ugly things that were problems in society that a lot of folks might not have been aware of. And it's actually Teddy Roosevelt, oddly enough, that gives them that name, muckrakers. Teddy Roosevelt is one of our progressive era presidents. There are lots of different muckrakers that wrote these really sensational exposés on certain things, just are exposing lots of different problems that were published in magazines. Some of them published their own books. We're going to mention a few of the big ones here, although there are lots of them. Ida Tarbell wrote a book called The History of the Standard Oil Company, where she exposed some of the wrongdoing in the Standard Oil Company, one of those big giant trusts, some of the bribery that went on, the way that the workers were mistreated, all those kinds of things, really exposing to people just how corrupt some of that big business could be, and how some of those big businessmen, were truly just seeking out their own profits and how to line their own pockets rather than, doing anything that was good for the public at large. And these are, I use the word sensational. It is sensational writing, and it is designed to get people's attention. But unlike yellow journalism, the muckrakers are careful investigators. They carefully research and carefully gather data. They've got the facts to back this stuff up. And so it's far less tabloid-like. It's far less clickbait-like. It is more like true investigative journalism, where they say, here's what's really going on, and exposing that to a lot of people. Another example of a muckraker is Jacob Riis, who published a book called How the Other Half Lives. And by the other half, he meant the poor. And this was a lot of photographs, many photographs, like photographic essays that he took in different places around New York, showing the terrible conditions in tenements, in sweatshops, out on the streets, filth, the conditions of immigrants, of other poor people, of children. And when people see that, they are just shocked and horrified. And it does actually lead to a lot of changes in some cities, where they will work to improve tenements, in some cases actually get rid of them and make better housing, put regulations on factories and things like that to improve the conditions of workers, more education. All of these muckrakers, not only, their purpose was to get people outraged so that they would do something about it. And that's exactly what happens in many cases. Probably considered one of the best examples of a muckraker. It kind of becomes sort of the poster child of the muckrakers, maybe one of the most well-known. was Upton Sinclair, who wrote a book called The Jungle. And in The Jungle, he wrote about the meatpacking industry in Chicago. And it's a novel, it's fiction, but it is based off of the true facts that he had found out about the meatpacking industry, which, as you can imagine, was incredibly unsanitary, just absolutely repulsive and disgusting, about meatpacking industry and how the workers were so unsafe and people were getting hurt and injured and fingers chopped off into the vats of meat, and how they would put other stuff in there that wasn't meat, sawdust, and then chemicals to make it smell okay and look better when it was actually spoiled, and all this kind of stuff, and then just putting that in a can and labeling it as canned beef or whatever and selling it to the public when it might be spoiled, it might be tainted, it might have all kinds of stuff in it. This is before there were any kind of regulations to stop that. That's why we have those kinds of regulations now. A lot of them actually are passed in the progressive era. So Upton Sinclair's novel particularly even inspired people like Teddy Roosevelt to do something about that. And so we'll see later on in the progressive movement laws passed for consumer protection purposes to stop a lot of that. Let's take a look at political progressivism, because progressivism, what we're looking at here is how progressivism kind of got started and had some success in making some changes at the state level and the local level before it starts really being taken up nationally. And as I mentioned, a lot of the progressives were seeking political changes. They were disturbed by the amount of corruption in government. They want to make government more democratic. They want to make it more fair. They want to get power out of the hands of those big party bosses and get it back in the hands of the people and make it efficient and better. So some of the ways that they start doing that. A lot of cities and municipalities and counties will start implementing the use of what's called an Australian ballot, which basically just means a secret ballot, a ballot that you mark privately. To us, that might sound like, well, duh, you mark your ballot privately. But before this, that wasn't always the case. It was possible that maybe you didn't even mark your ballot. You might have walked up to a voting employee, or not employee, but a voting booth worker and polling place worker, and tell them who you wanted to vote for. For one thing, that's pretty intimidating to have to tell somebody. And two, how do you know they're going to record it correctly? Or you may have those big party bosses or folks just kind of looking over your shoulder. So that meant that people may not have felt free to really choose who they wanted and cast their votes in a way that was, really fair. And that was where there was more accountability. So that becomes the norm as it is for us. And we expect probably now that privacy, either with dividers or booths or something like that. These three things, they're all a little bit different. And the purpose here is not for you to know exactly what each specific one is, but just overall what they do. Initiative, recall, and referendum. Initiative, like a citizen's initiative, that means that the people can basically force or get their legislators, their Congresses, to consider a law. So maybe I go out and start an initiative to ban alcohol on Sundays or something like that. If I get enough signatures, and every state would do it differently, they all have their own rules about it, but that would mean that even if the state legislature isn't interested in doing that, if I get enough citizens to say they want to do it, they have to look at it. So you see that gives the citizens more control over what their state legislators are going to do. A recall, not all states have this, but recall, just like when they recall a product because it's defective or there may be something wrong with it, this is basically the same thing with an elected official. A recall election would mean, say, our governor or the mayor or somebody is not doing a good job, or they're mismanaging things, or we don't like them for some reason. Not necessarily they've done something illegal, but we just think they're doing a bad job. We could have a recall election. We could basically have another election to possibly vote them out before their term is up. A referendum, so you can see how that would make elected officials more accountable for their actions. If there was a recall election and you give the citizens the power to get rid of those people even before their term is out. A referendum means you're letting the people vote on a legislative measure. So like a tax referendum, we have those a lot around here. Every couple of years you'll hear about vote no on this tax, or vote no to allow the sale of this, or vote yes or no to allow, people to turn their houses into Airbnb locations and stuff like that, or to allow Uber or something along those lines. Those are referendums. You're letting the people decide on those kind of things instead of just leaving it up to elected officials. So you can see how the purpose of all of those is to make government more democratic and to give the people, regular people, more power and give them more a voice in what's going on, taking that power away from big city bosses and, people that were, kind of more elitist, I suppose. Another probably a big example, and this goes into national progressivism to make the government more democratic. We start to see a movement, and this was not the first time this had been proposed, a movement for the direct election of senators. When the Constitution was originally drafted, and up until this point, senators were not voted on by the people; they were chosen by state legislatures. And so, with all of this talk about making the government more democratic, making the government more responsive to what the people wanted, that creates a bigger movement to say senators shouldn't be appointed. They ought to be elected by the people, just like members to the House of Representatives are. And if you recall, this was actually originally proposed by the populists. This was something that they had talked about decades before this. That eventually results in the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, which changes the Constitution to say that senators they're no longer appointed, but they are elected and they have to run for office by popular vote the same way that our representatives do. On a side note, there are 4 actually progressive era amendments. If you remember, there were 3 Reconstruction amendments. There are 4 progressive ones, 16, 17, 18, and 19. And we don't talk about them in order for some reason, but there's one of them, 17, direct election of senators, making the government more democratic. Speaking of also making the government more democratic, there's a whole, half of the population that wants to be included more in the government. We'll talk in a moment about how women were a huge part of the progressive movement, and the progressive movement provides an opportunity for a lot of them to continue to push for greater rights for themselves. So another aspect of progressive reform is women's rights. Many progressives are feminists, and so there's an ongoing campaign for women's suffrage, which of course means the right to vote. And not only was women's right to vote, women's suffrage campaign, a part of progressivism itself, it was embraced by a lot of progressives. There were a lot of progressives that were seeking other things, but also through their support to women's right to vote. They saw women as a great ally in that, and women were supportive of a lot of other progressive reforms. That does eventually result in another progressive era amendment, the 19th. That one gets in there right at the really the true end of the progressive era. Some might even argue that technically the progressive era was kind of over with by that point. But it's all kind of gray. It's not like they just threw the hammer down and said progressivism's over. But that does eventually result in that, and that is part of the progressive movement. Again, a lot of the progressive reforms are happening at the state and local level before you see a lot of stuff happening at the national level. Now, these things here, the commission plan of government, the use of city managers and regulatory commissions, once again, your purpose and my purpose, it's not for you to know exactly how each of those things work. They're all kind of similar, a little bit related. It's the overall purpose. The purpose of all of these things, what they all do and why it's progressive, they all make city government, it puts more control of city government in the hands of the people, and it gets the control of city government out of the hands of those big party bosses. And it means that it's going to be more efficient and it's going to be more democratic. So a commission plan of government, and this little graphic here kind of explains it a little bit. So you have the voters who elect, a city council, they elect a mayor. The mayor and the city council are going to hire someone like a city manager, who is then going to hire all of your city employees, like your sanitation workers and the police department or other public safety department is going to be under their finance, other kinds of utilities, water and sewer and sometimes electricity and all kinds of things like that. So while that city manager wasn't elected, they're hired by people that are. So it's providing, the people kind of an indirect way of, having that kind of management over their city. It also means that all of those public utilities like water and sanitation, whether that's garbage collection or sewer and all those kind of things, they are city owned. Those kind of things are being operated by the city instead of being operated by private companies. And the reason why that was a problem is because in the days of those big city bosses, what private companies do you think they hired? Well, the ones that they probably owned, or the ones that their brother-in-law owned, or the one that agreed to give them, a kickback, or that was bribing them and all that kind of stuff. So this hopefully would perhaps not totally get rid of, but it would minimize bribery. It would minimize, city leaders trying to skim off the top and all that kind of stuff, and just creates more accountability. Regulatory commissions are regulating all that stuff, regulating the utilities, regulating the, different public services and public work, so that they're not charging outrageous prices, so that they're not skimming off the top, looking into their activities to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to do and not doing things that they're not supposed to do. We also see the resurgence of temperance reform in the progressive era. You may remember temperance reform from the early 19th century. That was the movement to limit or ban alcohol. So that one comes back with full force. It's supported by a lot of progressives, including a lot of women who believed that a lot of the country's problems were caused by excessive alcohol use. This is probably also related to immigration. And they will also eventually have some temporary success. This was actually where you'll get another one of those progressive era amendments. The 18th actually is the prohibition of alcohol. We'll talk about that one a little bit more later. A lot of progressives, there's just tons of other kinds of social reforms here involved in the progressive movement, where it's improvements in education, whether that's elementary education, night school for immigrants. The settlement house movement is where a lot of that comes from. Curbing juvenile delinquency, improving prison systems, attempts to regulate the railroads, to regulate other kinds of industries, to regulate, to stop fraud and some of those kinds of things. All those regulatory commissions I was just talking about. Cleaning up the factories, cleaning up the tenements, making cities cleaner and healthier, and all those kinds of things. So there's lots of different areas that progressives were, it's not just one thing. There were so many different areas in which these progressives were trying to fix problems or address things that they saw as being big issues that were really affecting people's lives. And you can see how they're overall just trying to make things better for a lot of people. Progressive women, I've already mentioned multiple times that women are overwhelmingly involved in the progressive movement. In a time where most of them could not vote, this provides an opportunity for many of them to feel like they have a voice and feel like they can provide some kind of change, or be a part of some kind of change, be a part of something that they feel very impassioned about. And particularly this is true of, these are mostly middle and upper middle class women. A lot of them, although these are not problems that they experience, they're not the ones who are suffering in the tenements, but they feel it is their job and their duty to speak for those who can't speak for themselves, to be a voice for those that don't have a voice. And they are particularly active in not only the fight for their own rights, but the fight for better conditions for workers, and particularly for women and for children. And they were appalled by things like child labor and the terrible conditions that children were living in and working in, and the way many women were, their husband was gone, or, delinquent or whatever, that they were having to support their family. And so they're wanting more support for women with dependent children, and those kind of things. And these women are, seeing this as not a rejection of gender roles. It's not that they are rejecting being women. And many of them would agree that as women, they were different. And as women, they were supposed to be nurturers and they were supposed to be caregivers. But they actually would argue that their activities here, their involvement in all these reforms, that was an extension of their female roles, not a rejection of them. That they, as women, as nurturers, as caregivers, as all of those things, that actually made them better suited to find those problems and to do something about them. Many women, not just women, but a lot of women supported and started the National Consumers League, which was an organization that pushed for laws to protect women and children in the workplace. And this is where it gets a little weird for us, because a lot of the things that they were supporting and advocating for and worked very, very hard for are the very kind of things that would come under fire now, that a lot of feminists would have an issue, not even just feminists, but a lot of people have a problem with today. And there's been a lot of concern about these things today. But laws that would say like women couldn't do particular types of labor. Their thinking was women are different, women are more delicate, therefore they shouldn't be doing the same kind of things in the workplace as men because they could get hurt more easily, or women shouldn't have to work as many hours and those kind of things. Clearly, again, those laws today would be seen as discriminatory against women. But at this time, those were seen as ways of protecting women and protecting children in the workplace. Now, speaking of workplace protection, one thing we need to just sort of mention as kind of a landmark moment, a very tragic but a landmark moment in worker protection. We've mentioned one of the big reasons why, there's multiple reasons, but one of the big reasons why union workers, and unions have been unsuccessful in getting a lot of change, in getting better conditions and all of that stuff, is because public opinion was simply against them. It was just kind of the general consensus that employers were not responsible for the health and the safety and the well-being of their employees. That it was what it was, and that if you got hurt at work, that was your problem. And if something happened to you, big, whatever, it didn't. It was not the job of government to tell businesses that they had to make sure the factory was safe. An event that really starts to turn the tide on that and change public opinion about that was a terrible fire that occurred in 1911 at a company called the Triangle Shirtwaist Company. A shirtwaist is a type of shirt. And this fire broke out in this, basically a sweatshop where mostly women worked, sewing, seamstresses sewing these or using machines to sew these shirts. And they couldn't get out because there were no safety regulations. There were no fire escapes, certainly no fire extinguishers to get them out. And even a lot of the doors and windows were locked because the employers didn't want them to take breaks and leave early and things like that. So they were basically locked in there. So a lot of them burned to death. Some of them eventually jumped to their deaths. And so this fire happens, and there's these women, just dead on the street, burned. You can see some of the unfortunate victims here in this picture. And, when this is put in the newspapers and people see this, they're horrified by it. And the point is that it starts to shift public opinion. People are outraged by this. They are outraged over the conditions, and that so many of these, poor women had lost their life because their employers didn't protect them. This was a situation where, there should have been a fire escape and they should have been able to escape, but they couldn't. So that changes public opinion and begins to make the public more agree that employers did have a responsibility to their employees, that it was their responsibility to make sure that their employees would be safe at work, and that while accidents might happen, there should certainly be protocols and regulations, and that it was just ultimately their job. That was part of what they were supposed to do. So we will start to see in the progressive era, we'll look at it a little bit later, some more assistance and more, finally, some lasting changes for workers and part of the labor movement. And we will look next time at how the progressive movement starts to be taken up nationally during the presidency of Teddy Roosevelt. Not only is he a big imperialist, but also a progressive.